In this video, I'm going to show you how to dial in your brew system and brewing process. I'm going to show you what you need to do in order to get a recipe output that matches your recipe input, meaning that you take a recipe from someone and what you make is exactly what you got on that recipe. How many times have you made a 5-gallon batch of beer where you ended up with 4 gallons of beer? How many times did you copy a grain bill only to find out that your gravities and alcohol by volumes are off? Or your bitterness levels? Or your color? You can adjust and correct for all of that to ensure that the recipe you get out of your brew system and process align with the recipe that you started with. If something like that interests you, stick around and I'll show you the details. So I'm going to cover 4 major topic areas in this video, and I'm going to put chapters in here so you can skip to them now or later, or come back and skip to whatever chapters you want. There'll be chapters in the video and down in the video description so you can jump around as you need to if you have to go back and rewatch this in the future. But I got 4 main areas that I want to cover. Calibrating measuring devices, accounting for equipment differences, accounting for process differences, and putting it all together. How many times have you made a recipe where your outputs in terms of gravity readings or colors or IBUs or anything else are just not aligned with the recipe that you got? And you wondered, well, I did something wrong, right? Well, maybe you didn't do something wrong, maybe you did, but you don't know because your devices that you take the measurements are not calibrated properly. You might be thinking that you're hitting your gravity numbers right, but you could be off. Or you think that you're off, but they could be right. It's because you didn't measure your volumes correctly, or your gravities, or you're measuring them at a temperature other than what your devices are calibrated for. So I'm going to go over 3 areas about calibration. How to take good and accurate specific gravity readings, taking accurate volume measurements, and making sure that you're doing all this at the temperatures that you need to compare apples to apples in your recipes and process. Starting off with your specific gravity readings, it's very common that you use one of 2 types of gadgets to measure these, right? There's the hydrometer and there's the refractometer. Now, both of these have pros and cons to each of them, and you need to understand what they are to know how to best use them to make sure that you aren't getting incorrect readings. Hydrometers are usually the first thing that new brewers start with and old-timers still hang on to, and they're very valid for good reasons. Even if you choose a refractometer, who some think are better than hydrometers, which is not true. Some cases, yes, there's pros and cons to each, but when it comes to hydrometers, they have some things that you have to be aware of. Hydrometers are only accurate to the temperature that they're rated for. So if you take your temperature at anything other than the calibrated temperature, you're going to be off. Now there's some cheat sheets out there that can help you make adjustments for slight variations of temperature. So if you're in the ballpark of the calibrated temperature, you can read off a chart for every degree or 2 or above or below. You can add or remove a pointer to a specific gravity to adjust for it. They're not completely accurate every time. A better way to do it is to use a calculator of some sort. There's brewing tools out there like my own spreadsheet. I got to throw a plug out for that as well, that you can download and correct. So you can input a sample, let's say, instead of 60 degrees Fahrenheit where it might be calibrated, you measure it at 72, 75 degrees, and it will calculate the adjustment for you. There's other software tools out there that will do this, of course, too, but of course I'm biased because I have my own. But those only work within a limited range. I mean, you really can't measure a 150 degree sample of work on a hydrometer and expect any equation to be really close to that. So you really want to get that temperature down within a reasonable amount of around where your calibrated temperature is. It doesn't have to be exact. Again, you can use these calculators or cheat sheets, but as long as you make those corrections for temperature, you should be okay. Another mistake that people do with hydrometers is that they don't calibrate them first. They presume they came from the company they ordered them from and they're dead nuts accurate. They're not. Not always. In fact, these home brewing hydrometers really are just the home brewing level. They're not laboratory grade. They're not precision. They are pretty good, but they're not great. They generally have a plus or 2 points of a tolerance in their readings just out of the box, but they're also not always calibrated. For example, if you dip a hydrometer in a vial of distilled water at your calibrated temperature, and if it doesn't read 1.000, you need to calibrate your hydrometer. I've done a whole video on how to calibrate your hydrometer. I can put the link to it right up here for you to go get it. It's very useful, a lot of background as to how to do it. So I would highly recommend go calibrate your hydrometers first. Also, my brewing spreadsheet, once you know what that offset is, you can input that in as an offset in the spreadsheet, so it always takes care of it for you. You don't always have to remember to add and subtract the number. I'm sure other brewing software tools also can do this for you too. I'm not sure which ones can and cannot, but I'm sure they have to be out there. It's not that hard to do. But if not, make the adjustment yourself. Another problem with hydrometers is that they're hard to read, especially the home brewing ones. The little tick marks are so close together, and that you have to read from the bottom of the meniscus, not the top. That's another common issue I've seen people do. They take the readings at the top of the meniscus, which is incorrect. So they are already getting wrong numbers. But even if you try to measure the bottom level, it's really hard to do in these little hydrometers at the home brewing scale. The ticks are too close together. Makes it's human error at this point trying to read that number. So you could be off by a few gravity points possibly, just by an error in measurement using your own eyes. It's better to use a laboratory grade set of hydrometers, a set, which means there's actually 2 or more hydrometers, each of them calibrated to a specific range. So the tick marks are spread out further, making human error less likely to be a contributing factor. And they're calibrated to a smaller range, which also makes them more accurate. So you might have one from 1.000 to 1.030, another one from 1030 to 1060, 1060 to 1090, right? So you get those out there and they're much easier to read, you get much more accurate results. But those do tend to get more expensive. So as a compromise, there is some hydrometers out there. One of them that I have in my possession from Brewing America is the Precision Lab Grade one. It goes from 1.0 to 1.1 and with bigger tick marks, wider tick marks between the ticks to make it easier to read. It's a compromise between the lab grade set, which is more expensive, and the cheaper single hydrometers that homebrewers use. So if you can't afford the lab grade set, go ahead and go for the one that I just mentioned there. I'll put a link in the video description or up here as well. And one other common mistake that people who use hydrometers make is that they take their readings with a heterogeneous mixture or wort. And what I mean by that, it's not homogeneous, it's not mixed. What people do is that, and I've got many questions on this, which is why I'm covering this here in this video, is that people will take a measurement reading after they lautered from their mash tun right into their kettle. They'll dip their wine thief in there or take a sample from their ball valve on the side of the kettle, and it will be either too high or way too low, and they think they did something completely wrong. What happens then is, what's going on is that aside from the temperature being a factor, which is you also have to, again, adjust for, is that the people are not stirring the wort. See, what happens is that when people lauter from their mash tun and put it into their kettle, that first layer down at the very bottom is the most dense. And by the time the last runnings hit, it's much lower gravity. And this applies for any types of sparging, fly sparging, bass sparging, nose sparging. Well, maybe not nose sparging as much, but the point is that the lower level is going to be denser than the higher level. So what you want to do is give that mashed paddle out or a big spoon, stir it up really good, then take your reading. I've fell prey to that myself over the years, and I've learned my lessons from that, and I'm sharing that with you and hope that you don't make the same mistake. Now moving on to refractometers. They may be more convenient than hydrometers in some ways, but they're not always better. Refractometers are also temperature sensitive, which means you have to cool the sample down within reason. Now there's models out there with ATC or automatic temperature correction, and I have one of those as well. But they really, again, are only workable within a limited range, and you have to wait the required amount of time for the sample to stabilize in on the refractometer in order to get the accurate readings. So taking a 150-degree sample and measuring it right away in a refractometer isn't going to work for you. You'll get wrong readings. All right, so just keep that in mind. Even with the ATC models, there's a more reasonable range there that you might want to get your sample down to. It doesn't take long for a few drops of wort to cool down, at least compared to a vial or a flask full of hydrometer wort, right? So it doesn't take that long, just a little patience. You take your sample, let it cool, and then read it, and you should be good to go. So they're more convenient from the standpoint that you use less wort for your sample than a hydrometer. It takes less to cool down, but there are some serious drawbacks to refractometers. For one, they're affected by color. The color of your wort is going to throw off that reading because refractometers work by bending light through a liquid, right? And you have different colors of liquid. The light's going to refract to different degrees and impact the refraction caused by the sugar in the wort, which is what we're trying to ultimately measure. So there's a correction factor that you can apply. Now there's a common one out there, I think it's called 1.04, which is an adjustment or a wort correction factor. That's sort of like a starting point, but truth is, to get a real accurate wort correction factor for your wort, you need to take a lot of measurements of a lot of your different beer styles of different colors, keep a tabulated log, and come up with your average to use. And that's really what you should be using. And that average won't be the same for every beer style. Every color is going to have a different impact on that readings. So just be aware of that. Now, some brewing software can take that correction factor and plop it in, like my spreadsheet can do, and other brewing tools to adjust for that. But the truth is that you really need to know what the real correction factor is to get real numbers at the end of this. But if you don't know, use the 104. It gets you in the ballpark at least. Another big downside to using refractometers is that they're only accurate on unfermented wort. That's right. You think you're making beer, it's going to measure the final beer that's got the alcohol in it? Nuh-uh. You'll get a really, really wrong reading if you were to use a refractometer on fermented wort. However, there are some empirical formulas that have been experimentally determined by others, not me of course, but others out there online, and you can go find some of these websites. They have really good information. But using some of these experimental correction formulas will help you reconvert that incorrect post-fermented reading into a more representative reading that would be more accurate, but it's not 100% accurate. And to be fair, hydrometers aren't either. I did mention this earlier, but after your hydrometer, your wort is fermented, your hydrometer reading is going to be off a little bit too. But for homebrewing purposes, not a big deal. Another downside is, just like for hydrometers, you have to have a mixed wort. You can't just take a freshly lathered, pre-boiled kettle volume, take a sample from the top or bottom, and expect it to be representative of the average gravity in that whole batch. You need to stir it up really well, make it homogeneous before you take that reading, even with a refractometer. One final mistake I've seen refractometer users make, for homebrewing at least, is to read the wrong scale on the refractometer. So a lot of them, most of them, have either have both a Brix scale on one side of the eyepiece and a specific gravity scale on the other. And I've seen many of them read the specific gravity and write that down as like it's God, right? It's like that's the number. It's not the number. It's not accurate. What you really should be doing is using the Brix reading, put it through a conversion formula to convert it properly to specific gravity, and write that value down after the conversion. Now, I have a spreadsheet that also helps with that as well. I'm sure many other brewing software tools also can do this. So just keep that in mind. Don't use the specific gravity scale in the refractometer. Use the Brix one. Okay, let's move on to volumes. Volumes are going to be a little tricky as well, and people don't put too much thought into it. Everyone's focused on gravity readings all the time, but truth is, your volume affects your specific gravities. It affects everything. It affects your color, it affects your bitterness, it affects your final alcohol. It impacts everything. That's why it's important. A complicating factor around volume is that it changes with temperature. Water or wort will expand and contract with temperature, and we do a lot of heating and contracting in the brewing process. We start with either groundwater that's really cold, and we heat it up, and then we get it to a boil, and we cool it down, and we're taking measurements all along the way. And we need, if you want to get accurate measurements on your volume, and therefore accurate predictions on what you're going to get from your outputs in your recipe, you really want to know what those temperatures are and how to account for those shrinkage or expansion differences in every step of the process too. For example, if you measure out your starting water volume, let's say it's 51.7 quarts at groundwater temperature. Let's say it's 56 degrees, which is common for me. And you measure it again, and it measures at 52.7 at your pre-boil volume, which is, let's say it's 152 degrees. You'll get an error of 1 quart in your measurement. Take that to a boil, and the error becomes 2.1 quarts from the starting water volume to the boil. That's over a half gallon. The half gallon is going to throw off your readings for everything else, from your gravities again, to your color, to everything. So if you're looking to zero in on your outputs, focus on that too. Another thing that's really common, unfortunately, when it comes to measuring accurate volumes is the markings on your brewing equipment, whether it be your kettle, your all-in-one, your mashed equipment, whatever it is. They'll have tick marks etched or etched onto, scratched, whatever, embedded, raised letters, whatever they are. How do you know what temperature those were taken at? You don't, right? So again, if you just jump to conclusions and assume it's the same temperature that you think you're measuring your water at, you could be off. You could be filling it up to a certain volume fill level. You think it's what it shows, but how do you know? It probably isn't. and take that with the temperature where you raise and lower it to the mash temperatures, to the oil temperatures, to the post-chilling temperatures. How do you know what you got for real? You don't. But there's a workaround. What I do is I basically make a measuring dipstick for each application. So I'll take a strip from the hardware store. I'll go buy a strip of aluminum or stainless steel, and I'll calibrate a milk jug to exactly 1 gallon at, let's say, like 68 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll calibrate that jug by measuring several fills of a 500 milliliter graduated cylinder, which is laboratory grade at that temperature. It's slow to set up. You have to make sure every vial is at the right temperature. You mark your milk jug or your water jug at certain points along the way at that same reference temperature, and you have a baseline that you can always go back to. Then you can use that 1 gallon jug now to fill up several times, to fill up several gallons worth in your kettle. And each gallon or quarter gallon or quart or liter or whatever your unit of measure is, you would make a tick mark as you pour that into your vessel. You make a little tick mark, you etch it on there with a little etching tool or whatever you can mark it with. And once you get up to the max fill, then you can go ahead and put a little note on the thing that says that it's for this volume, vessel, mash tun, kettle, whatever, at the temperature that you're measuring at, right? And that's one dipstick, but you can also create multiple dipsticks for the same vessel. So let's say that you have one for your groundwater volume. You have one for your, let's say your final or main mash temperature volume. You can make one for your boil volume. And it's really easy to do. Once you have your first dipstick made at your groundwater temperature, you can heat the water up to any point that you want to have that baseline reference. Get a new dipstick or turn the other stick around and start measuring that. And I mean, yeah, it's slow, but you get an accurate result every time. So if you're trying to debug and troubleshoot why your recipe didn't match what the recipe that you were trying to copy from was, this is a helpful tool to help you figure out, was it the volume measurements? So now I've talked about temperature a number of times in context of gravity readings and volume measurements. And so therefore, temperature is also an important thing to make sure you can measure correctly. And depending on the type of thermometer you have, the approach can be a little different. For example, if you have one of those bimetal thermometers out there you got that came with your kettle or your equipment, or maybe one that you bought at the local store and you just attach it yourself, a couple of things that you need to keep in mind. For one, you need to calibrate them. So there's usually like a little screw on the back that you can set the water to a boil or a certain reference temperature, and then you can adjust that screw on the back of the bimetal thermometer to calibrate it for that temperature. But that's only calibrated for that temperature. Really, these bimetal ones are not super accurate. You can, even once you calibrate it to a set temperature, like let's say 155 degrees, maybe it'll be inaccurate for 175 degrees or 200 degrees or 100 degrees, right? So they're not the best. They take a while to show their reading. What I would recommend better than that is get an instant read digital. And I'm not really talking about the $8 discount bin one that you can get at Walmart, right? I'm talking about a quality, real true read, instant read, accurate thermometer. I use a Thermapen because I use it for cooking as well as brewing, and it costs more money. It does, but it's totally worth it, especially for the peace of mind. For those of you that use brew system controllers to control your temperatures and measure them, don't forget to calibrate those temperature probes. Your manual should come with instructions as to how to calibrate and set an offset for your system. So for example, I have my Spike Solo, my Blickman Brew Easy, my Grainfather. Those are the three that I have on hand here. I'm not sure about the Grainfather now, now that I think about it, but I know the other two definitely have the ability to set an offset. So you can fill your vessel with water, put it through a sort of faux brew cycle or mash cycle to get it up to your temperature. Use a true, again, instant read Thermapen or other high quality thermometer to collaborate or to corroborate the temperature that your controller is reporting. And if it's different, you want to make sure you offset that controller so when you actually think that you're at a certain temperature, you really are not actually off by 5 degrees, which can make a huge difference when it comes to mashing, right? Woo, okay, so now we're past all the calibration stuff. I know this took a while, but it's all important information. You all need to know this. Each of these have bitten me in the past, so I know anyone else who's new in the brewing, or those who may have been brewing for a while, it might make you think a little bit about, I never checked that. Let me go take a look. So please do. But now it's time to get on to the actual brew system itself. Now that you have all these calibrated devices and vessels and dipsticks and everything else, right? And you know how to use your hydrometer and refractometer correctly, it's time to start dialing in your brew system, right? And every brew system has got its own unique characteristics that you have to account for. You can't just take a recipe from someone who doesn't specify what system they brewed it on or what process they use and expect it to actually come out the exact same way in your system. And there's reasons for it. In fact, there's three main reasons for it. You have to account for dead space losses, absorption losses, and evaporation losses. All three of these sum up to making the difference whether a 5-gallon batch gives you 5 gallons worth of beer or 4 gallons worth of beer. How many times have you tried to make a 5-gallon batch of beer and you end up with 4 gallons and you're wondering what the heck happened to the other gallon? Well, you didn't adjust and scale your recipe accordingly to make the 5 gallons. So the first dead space loss we want to talk about are the mash tun, lauter ton dead spaces. And this is commonly the amount of work that is inaccessible while you're lautering to the kettle. So let's say you have a mash tun with a false bottom in it, and there's a space under that false bottom that's going to be liquid, but that liquid might be a little lower than the valve or the siphon or whatever it means you're using to extract that wort from that vessel. That's lost. That's considered a loss, right? So you have to be able to account for that loss by adding more wort or more grain to your recipe in order to make up for that. And it's not unique to just false bottoms. For those who use the manifold design, like me, quite often, it also affects you there as well. An exception to this are those who are using brew in the bag type systems, where your mash tun is also the boil kettle ultimately, because you put the mash pipe or mash basket into the kettle, you pull the grains out, and the liquid in the bottom is what you boil. Those kind of systems, those all-in-one or almost-in-one systems, as I like to call them, those wouldn't have any mash tun losses because that dead space is already in the kettle. It's there. So that would be 0 in that case. But for the rest of us, beware. And I forgot to mention one other exception, which I'm not much talking about nowadays, are those who are extract brewers. Most of what I'm talking about today are mainly around all grain brewing, because that seems to be the most common type of brewing. But for those who are just doing extract brewing, again, no loss there because you're not mashing. You're just pouring powder into a boil kettle later. So this stuff doesn't even apply to you then. So how do you measure dead space loss in the mash tun? The harder but more accurate method would be to scoop out the grains from a real brew day and fill a measuring vessel with the wort that was still on the bottom. An easier but a little less accurate method, which I would recommend doing if you're just getting into this and not sure where to start, is to pour just enough water in your mash tun to cover your drain. Open the drain, let it naturally drain out, or pump it out, whatever your method is. If you're using gravity or pump, use that same method because you'll get slightly different readings from either one. But the one that you do for your system, do that. Pour that remaining water out into again, your calibrated measuring jug, remember, and measure that. And therefore, that's a starting point that you can put into your recipe. It just means that you have to add that much more water to your total water volume, maybe a little more grain because you'll have some sugar losses there as well, but it gets you on the right path. So other dead space losses are now in your kettle. And to account for them, it's very similar to the mash tun thing. You pour a little bit of water in the bottom of your kettle, or more accurately on a real brew day, you can actually see what's in the bottom and drain it out and pour it out. But either way you do this, you can do it with plain water if you start from scratch, or if you have an existing brew day that you want to measure from. Either way, you let it drain all the way out, you pour the remainder of the liquid into your calibrated measuring device again, and get your reading there, and that will tell you what to put in for your next recipe iteration. Similar with fermenters. Once you're done siphoning or racking off your wort into your kegs or bottles, you'll have some of that left on the bottom. Pour off that liquid into that calibrated measuring jug and get a reading there, and that will be your fermenter loss. So now you take into account the mash tun loss, the boil kettle loss, and the fermenter loss. You can put that all into your brewing software or your hand calcs or my brewing spreadsheet or whatever you want to do, and come up with an adjusted recipe that will give you those same numbers on the outputs as what the recipe is calling for. Good stuff, huh? Another set of losses comes around grain and hops absorption rates. Grain absorption rates are more commonly talked about, hops not so much, but with grain absorption rates, if you're doing all grain brewing and you are adding some amount of water to your mash tun and your dried cracked grains, those grains are going to absorb a certain amount of that water. that water will no longer be available to you later on. It's a loss. So you need to account for that as well. And there's some good guidelines out there, some rules of thumb out there in the home brewing world. Commonly used ones, I'm using US units again. I'll convert those for you metric folks, but it's generally a half quart per pound, generally speaking, traditionally. Now, there's a lot of debate over that, especially for those who are doing brew in the bag type brewing nowadays. 20 years ago, a half a quart per pound was common knowledge. It was close enough. Today, my own experiments, I actually have another video I've done recently called something about grain absorption rates. So if you want to know what I'm talking about in detail, go check out that video after this video. But I did my own experiment with some systems to see why I was getting some odd numbers in some of my more recent brews since I started doing more brew in the bag brewing versus my traditional system, which was the cooler based one. And it was interesting. 0.5 quarts per pound was good for my DIY batch sparge cooler system, but when I got to the brew in the bag systems, all of them, they were about roughly 0.38 quarts per pound. Reasons for those abound, not the point of this video. Go see that other video where I talk about that in more detail. But it's something that you have to account for, otherwise you'll have a smaller batch size at the end. Same thing for hops. It's not commonly accounted for. At least when I started brewing over 20 years ago, hops wasn't even a consideration. Generally, you throw an ounce of hops in on a 5-gallon batch, maybe an ounce and a quarter if you're feeling bold. Nowadays, with today's home brewing trends of making big beer styles, big IPAs or New England style IPAs where you have several ounces of hops, now it comes into play, and those hops absorb some of that water too. So you definitely want, if you're going to be using a fair amount of hops in your recipe, you want to account for that loss from water absorption into the hops as well. And I've done another video recently on hop absorption rates. Again, I did an experiment. I did my own little experiment. I came to my own values and my own numbers to use in my recipes going forward to account for this. If you haven't seen that video, go check it out. I'll put a little link up here for you to go check that out, and in the video description as well. So after this video, go check that out as well. And another factor that we want to talk about is evaporation rates. Now, common evaporation rate that everyone talks about is the boil evaporation rate. Very big one. If you get a big kettle of water or wort boiling, you're going to get a lot of evaporation losses there. Over the course of an hour to an hour and a half or longer boil, you're going to lose a lot, a gallon or two probably, depending on how fast you're boiling this thing. So you need to make adjustments for that. So therefore, if it's such a big factor, you definitely want to get a handle on how much is really evaporating before your brew day is, right? So a couple of ways I go about doing it. If you're starting from scratch and don't have any baselines established from past brews, go ahead and pour an amount of water into your kettle, similar to your batch size. Go ahead and set it to a boil at which you would normally boil it to, whatever setting for your gas or electric that you need to get it to the boil that you like. And time it for an hour. You use the volume, again, a calibrated volume using your calibration device, so you have your known fixed volume. You boil it, you measure right after post-boil at the same temperature, and then you have a difference there. Now that difference is at boil. Now you have to do some conversions to scale it back down to room temperature where you'll be doing your kegging and racking from, right? Now my spreadsheet can handle it. I don't know about other tools, maybe not. But that's my latest version of my spreadsheet does do that for you, and that will definitely get you better in the ballpark as to how much water you need. Because if you're going to boil off a gallon and a half of water or a gallon of water over an hour, you want to add that gallon of water to the kettle up front. And a lesser known topic about evaporation rates is around the mash. It's a little experiment I did, also a video on my channel I'll put a link to up here recently, but I talked about mash evaporation rate being a factor on some systems, not all of them. So it depends on your system. If you have a closed mash system with a lid that's all sealed up and nice and neat, not a big factor. But if you have a system that you mash openly without the lid on, you're going to have some evaporation from that over the course of the hour or two that you're doing your mash in there, right? So, and it's not insignificant. It does add up over that amount of time, so you may want to account for that as well. Again, using the calibrated measuring jug, the reference temperatures, your calibrated thermometers, all that stuff in there to make sure you get a nice, accurate prediction of how much is going to evaporate, so you know how much more water to add at the start. Okay, we talked about calibrating devices and how to use them to do measuring things like boil-off rates and evaporation rates and losses and such, right? One thing I haven't yet quite got to is, what to me is more of a process a difference, but it's also a little bit related to your equipment too, so it can kind of go in either camp, but it's all about extract efficiency, your mash extract efficiency that you get from your mash tun and into your kettle, and how much sugar that you got and rinsed out of those grains. Now, you might have been a victim of this in the past, where you get a recipe that someone handed you that looked like it was photocopied 1,000 times. It's all faded from 1982 or something like that, or decades, or some online forum, whatever, right? And they give you the recipe and you want to brew it because it sounded like a good recipe, but they didn't put certain important pieces of information in the recipe itself. Sure, they got the grain bill, hop and all that, but what it was, the assumed extract efficiency they based their grain bill upon. If they don't have it on there, you're kind of hosed. You have to kind of just brew it, determine what the actual efficiency is, and write that down and take that into account in the future when you brew that batch again. But if you have an idea of what your extract efficiency is for your system, and hopefully, thankfully, they put an extract efficiency on the recipe, you can scale your grain bill and hops and water and everything in order to make sure that your outputs match what the recipe as design outputs are. I've done a couple of videos on this topic in the past. I'll put links up here and in the video description for those. But it's basic math. It's just scaling things up or down based upon a percentage or a ratio. Not hard to do. Brewing tools will do it for you, including my spreadsheet. So if you're not good at math or doing ratios and things like that, just use a tool. But you got to keep that in mind when you do these recipes, especially ones that you get from other people or other places. It's just one of those things that I see people ignore or don't pay attention to, and they end up not getting the same beer they expected when they started. So now by this time, you've done all this work, you've calibrated your devices, you got all your losses and your rates and all that stuff established, you measured, you're accurate, you're confident, you are aware of what extract efficiency is and how to scale and dial in a recipe from someone else for your needs. You're on the right path. You should be getting more accurate numbers, if not dead nuts accurate numbers. And if not, that's fine too. This is just a hobby again, folks. This is not anything to be obsessive compulsive over unless you are naturally that way. I care because I'm an engineer. I like numbers. I like math. I like going over old recipes and looking for trends and things like that. And if I can't trust those numbers, I don't trust the trends, right? So it's a personal thing for me. The beer still turns out fine. If I miss my numbers, if you miss your numbers, it'll probably be fine. Maybe you may not like it as much as you hope, but now then you take that lesson learned, you scale up, you add some more grain, you add a little less hops, whatever you need to do. But hopefully by the lessons learned in this video, you'll be well on your way to making great repetitive beers time and time again. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, give me that thumbs up. I really appreciate the thumbs up. The algorithms love it. I hope you found this video helpful. If you like it, give me that thumbs up for the algorithm, and be sure to subscribe if you're not a subscriber. I do all kinds of home brewing and cooking videos on my channel. I share what I do quite openly, as a matter of fact, including lessons learned, just what to do, but also what not to do sometimes, because we all make mistakes. And if you have a question or a comment, put them in the video description down below, or you can reach me on my website. Either way, send me a note. I'd like to hear from you. So take care, and I'll talk to you all next time.